Now it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Dr. James Tompkins, Chairman and CEO, Tompkins International. Jim is an international authority on designing and implementing end-to-end supply chains. As the founder and CEO of Tompkins International, his focus over the last several years has been in the areas of digital commerce, unichannel and supply chain reinvention, helping companies connect supply chain processes with the customer journey to increase long-term profitable growth. Jim coined the phrase, sell everywhere, which is the strategy of selling through a wide range of online and offline channels where customers shop, where they buy, where they enjoy products, offering a seamless end-to-end customer experience. Jim received the prestigious Frank and Lillian Gilbreth Industrial Engineering Award from IISE on June 1st, 2015. In addition, Jim has served as president of the Institute of Materials Management Society, the College Industry Council on Material Handling Education, and has been named Distinguished Engineering Alum by Purdue University. He's also received more than 50 additional awards for his service to the profession. Over the last 40 years, Tompkins International has evolved from a supply chain consulting firm into an end-to-end supply chain consulting and solutions company, with business units focusing on supply chain consulting services, material handling integration, and two recent entrepreneurial ventures, Monarch FX and Tompkins Robotics, which together with e-tail solutions form a true end-to-end digital commerce ecosystem. His 40-plus years as CEO of Tompkins International and his focus on helping companies achieve profitable growth give him an insider's view into what makes great companies even better. As a high-level business and supply chain strategy advisor, his unique perspective prepares corporations and executives for the future. Jim is a thought leader, sharing insights on business strategy through his presentations and videos, including his most recent, Anti-Brittle, succeeding and flourishing in these uncertain and volatile times. Jim also shares his knowledge and provides up-to-date information on supply chain and business trends via LinkedIn and Twitter. He's written or contributed to more than 30 books, been quoted in hundreds of business and industry magazines, such as the Journal of Commerce, Supply and Demand Chain Executive, DC Velocity, and Fortune. And he's spoken at thousands of international engagements. Jim received his Bachelor of Science in Industrial Engineering in 1969, his MSIE in 1970, and his PhD in 1972, all from Purdue University. Here's a warm virtual welcome to my friend and colleague, Jim. Take it away.
Hello, I'm Jim Tompkins, and it's my pleasure to be a keynote speaker at this year's IISE annual conference. I've titled this talk, 2020, One Heck of a Decade. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to get that on a PowerPoint slide. I sent it in to my technician that does the PowerPoint, and it came back 2020, one heck of a year. And I wrote back, I said, no, it's 2020, one heck of a decade. And they wrote back, said, got it, and they wrote 2020, 2030, one heck of a decade. And I said, no, the title of the talk is 2020, one heck of a decade. What we're talking about is that the last 10 months of 2020 has been like a decade. The 10 months has been like 10 years. The fact of the matter is there's still 16% left of the year. What's going to happen? Today's election day. By the way, I hope you all have voted. But it is my honor to be speaking today at the annual IISE conference. I tell you, I've been involved with AIIE, IIE, and IISE for either 51 years or 54 years. It depends how you count. See, I joined AIIE in 1968, and as a member until 1972. And then I joined again in 1975, and I'm still a member today. What happened between 1972 and 1975? Well, some of you may remember something called the draft board. And I had an opportunity to go in the Army for 3 years. And so those 3 years, I think my pay when I started in the Army was $230 a month. I made it all the way up to $350 a month, but I wasn't going to pay for my AIIE membership out of that small income. And so I didn't serve, I wasn't a member for those 3 years. And so I think I should be given 54 years credit because I was serving the country, but it's 51 officially. I have served AIIE, IIE, and ISIE in numerous ways. At Purdue University, I was the president of the student chapter. At NC State, I was the faculty advisor for the student chapter. I was the president of the Raleigh chapter. I was a regional vice president. I served in different capacities on the board for 14 years of AIIE and IIE. And so I really have been dedicated to this organization. I'm the president of the Institute of Industrial Engineers, past president now. I have been made a fellow of the Institute. I've had the greatest honor of my life is when I received the Frank and Lillian Gilbreth Award from the Institute. And so I am a hardcore IISE guy. Now, there's an old saying that says you never can come home again. As I researched that phrase, I found out it wasn't because the home changes, but the person changes. The person matures, the person grows, the person changes, and when they come home, it's not the same because they are different. Well, in this circumstance, it's great to come home again because I am as enthusiastic and as excited about what us as industrial and systems engineers are doing as I have ever been. I'm as excited about what IISE is doing. And so what the work we are doing is extremely important and continues to be critical to our society. And so I'm excited to be here today as your keynote speaker. So let's begin with 2020. One heck of a decade. Let's lay some groundwork. First of all, the foundation of 2020. The foundation goes back to the topic of black swans. In Europe, they thought black swans meant something that was impossible back in the 1600s. And so if you said something was a black swan in Europe in 1550, they said that means it's impossible because all swans that they had ever seen in the world were white. But in 1697, a Dutch explorer went to Western Australia, and in Western Australia, he saw a black swan. And so that changed the definition of a black swan from something that's impossible instead to something that's extremely rare and has a massive impact. And that's the definition of a black swan today. Well, if we look at 2000 through 2019, we see year after year after year an increase of the number of black swans. In fact, still, black swans are rare, but they're much more frequent. The rare events occur much more frequently. In June of 2019, I gave a speech entitled Succeeding and Flourishing in Uncertain and Volatile Times. And the reason I gave that speech is I was studying black swans, and I saw the rate of black swans went from once a year to once a month. And by 2019, I was seeing black swans in different areas of the world, in different areas, in different topics, occurring literally every week. And so black swans were really increasing their frequency, and so succeeding and flourishing in uncertain and volatile times was very important. In November of 2019, I took it a step further. I did a videotape called The Beyond Belief Impacts of VUCA on Supply Chains and Commerce. I went beyond black swans and started to talk about VUCA. So what is VUCA? VUCA was actually invented in the late 1980s by the U.S. Army War College in response to what they thought was going to be a new level of uncertainty in the world. They believed the Berlin Wall was going to fall soon. They believed the Soviet Union was going to collapse. And they believed the Cold War would really begin between Soviet Union and the United States. They anticipated a new style of management, a new philosophy of leadership that would be needed in times when things were really changing rapidly. And so they invented the philosophy and the word of VUCA. VUCA is an acronym. The V stands for volatility, where the nature, the frequency, and the speed of change is just rapidly increasing. And so there's a huge level of volatility. Volatility can be internal to your organization or can be external, that a competitor is coming back and doing something to you. But the volatility of business and of policies and political systems is very, very volatile. That's the first V of VUCA. The U of VUCA is for uncertainty. It's a lack of predictability. It's hard to plan. It's hard to do budgeting. It's hard to make decisions because of the level of uncertainty. And so V is for volatility. U is for uncertainty. C stands for complexity, where there's a multitude of forces, oftentimes conflicting forces, that are very hard to define what is the objective that we're trying to accomplish. If we're doing modeling, what is the objective function? There's multiple objectives, and so it's very complex. So V is volatility, U is uncertainty, and C is complexity. Last is A, and that's ambiguity. Ambiguity says there's a haziness. We're not able to really, what is reality? Is this true or is this untrue? There's a potential for misreads. There's a potential for misunderstandings. There's a lack of clarity. If you look at how business is evolving, the companies are moving forward, but oftentimes they're behind the customers. The customers are saying, I want 2-day delivery, and so the companies are going, oh, we got to go from 4 days to 3 days to 2 days, but when they get to 2 days, the customer has moved again, and now they want 1 day. They want next day delivery. And so there's an ambiguity as to what the requirements are. So VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Now, let's look at VUCA of 2020. And literally, I have gone back and looked at week by week what has happened in the year. Now, I'm not going to cover that, but let me cover a few of the major issues that are impacting us in 2020. And I want to give you 7 VUCA examples of what's going on in 2020. Well, obviously, the first example is the pandemic. COVID-19 is unbelievable, the impact. And so if we look at COVID-19, what we see is that around the end of 2019, COVID broke out in China. And it started having an impact on China. When they took their break at Chinese New Year, where everyone goes back to the place where they were born, and so everyone was away from the work when the lockdown occurred. What resulted is the people couldn't get back to work. And so the factory of the world was closed. There were no components or products coming out of China. Supply in the world was broken. It took the Chinese about 2 months to get that back and running and starting having products and components flow, where people could start selling the products and they could use the components to build other products. But what occurred is just about that same time, China exported COVID-19. And so they were then opening up the product flow, but they also opened up the transportation and the flow. And what occurred is COVID was exported to the whole world. And so the whole world had this COVID-19 thing, and that resulted in lots of lockdowns. Those lockdowns abroad affected demand. And so we had an uncertainty of supply, and we had an uncertainty of demand. And so if you're looking at a supply chain, where the basic objective of supply chain is to balance your supply and demand, you don't have control of your supply, you don't have control of your demand. And so what we had was a medical issue that became a huge economical issue. The second point I'd like to make about VUCA in 2020 has to do with hurricanes and wildfires. Hurricanes are named after a person's name, And the hurricane alphabet only has 21 letters in it, not 26. The 5 letters they don't use are Q, U, X, Y, and Z. They don't use those. So after the 21st storm in a year, what they do is they start using the Greek alphabet. And so they say alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta. And so that is the Greek alphabet. In 2020, it is only November 3rd, and we have already had storm named Delta. That's the 25th storm of the year. There's only been one Delta in the history of mankind, and we've got 27 more days before the end of November when the hurricane season stops. And so we've got a record number of hurricanes, and we've already had Delta. Epsilon is next. It will be coming. And so we're going to have a record number of hurricanes. If you look at wildfires, 5 out of the 6 largest wildfires in the history of the world that have occurred in California have occurred in the year 2020. So we have records in wildfires and in hurricanes. That's VUCA. That's volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, the ambiguity that comes from those earthquakes, from those hurricanes and those wildfires is unbelievable. There's a social upheaval that's taking place. Now this is interesting because this kind of follows a pattern. In 1870, a period just after the Civil War, they called that period the Reconstruction period. And the Reconstruction period had unbelievable social upheaval. And so what's happened is 50 years later, the Great Depression took place and there was huge social upheaval. And then 50 years later, in the 1970s, the Vietnam War, the assassination of Martin Luther King, there was huge social uprising. And then this year in Minneapolis, what we see is that there was a terrible death of Mr. George Floyd. And we have had, since that occurred, we've had social upheaval in the United States. So social upheaval has followed those 50-year trend, and 2020 is once again a record for social upheaval. If you look at bankruptcies, if we look at the number of bankruptcies across all corporations, we're at a 10-year high. If you look at the bankruptcies amongst retailers, this is a record year. There's more retail bankruptcies taking place in 2020 than ever before. If you look at geopolitical and financial crisis, this is around the world. Free trade, human rights, pollution, it's unbelievable what's happening. There's major geopolitical and financial crises taking place in China, the US, Europe, India, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. Oh my goodness, that's almost the whole world is undergoing geopolitical and financial crisis. That's a record of what's taking place there in 2020. In 2020, the swarming locusts. My goodness, have you looked at this? This is a record of the amount of destruction of land and crop that's taken place. They have already killed 450 billion, that's right, with the B, billion bad grasshoppers. That's what a locust is a bad grasshopper. It's unbelievable what's happened. And then number 7, as if those 6 weren't enough, is we have the world's largest non-nuclear explosion take place at the port of Beirut. On August 4th, the ammonium nitrate blew up in the port. And what happened is there were 300,000 people homeless. The explosion was felt in Turkey, Syria, Israel, Pakistan, and parts of Europe. The explosion was felt 160 miles away in Cyprus. I mean, my goodness sakes. So 2020, what a year. The pandemic is huge, but so are these other 6 huge situations. And so what we have is a number of black swans taking place in 2020. It's just unbelievable. The VUCA of 2020 is something that we've never experienced before. It's just beyond belief. So those 7 VUCA events, those 7 black swan events of 2020 has just had a huge impact. But where are we now in 2020? Today, there is uncertainty about uncertainty. Will there be a second wave of COVID? What's going to happen in the elections? What's going to happen in the budgets, both in the government and what's going to happen in the budgets in your company? You're finishing up budgets now. Your budgets are supposed to be done. How do you have a clue to understand what's going to happen? There's uncertainty. How do you have a budget? We're going to need to look at what's the impact on the economy. What happens on the economy is going to have an impact on the budget. What's going to happen on the second wave of COVID-19 is going to impact your budget. And so where we are is a situation where there's just total uncertainty. What's going to happen with holiday 2020? First of all, we know that Thanksgiving is not going to be the big blockbuster it usually is because we're not going to have any doorbuster sales. In fact, a lot of stores are going to be closed on Thanksgiving. Cyber Monday, Black Friday, those are not going to be big events. The big event happened back in October when Amazon and Best Buy and Walmart and Target had the big sale days. And so what they've done is they stretched the holiday. It doesn't start sometime in November now. It now starts in October. And so they've stretched it out. But what's going to happen with holiday 2020? Is it going to be buy online and pick up in store? Is it going to be buy online, pick up at curb? How is it going to be buy online and deliver to home? The deliver to home is a major problem. UPS and Federal Express could not possibly have planned for holiday 2020. They had no vision of the growth of e-commerce that's taken place. Digital commerce is just exploded. And so there's an uncertainty. Are we going to be able to get the final mile product delivered? And so what we see is UPS and Federal Express are doing the best job they can, given that this has occurred to them now, and they don't have the ability to build new facilities in 3 or 4 months. And so there's going to be regional carriers are going to be doing a lot of additional work, and there's going to be a lot of parcels in December of 2020 that are not going to be delivered on time. And so there's a tremendous level of uncertainty. And I think it's amazing because I see lots of people that are looking for the new normal. We got to get over it. There will never be a new normal. What we're going to find is going to be the next normal, and then the next normal, and the next normal, because the rate of black swans, the VUCA, is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity are going to be with us for the rest of our professional careers. And it's going to really have an impact on what we do. So where are we? Let me quote a Japanese scholar. And what he said is, "And once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain. When you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in. That's what the storm is all about." And so that one phrase in there, you won't even be sure the storm is really over. The storm will never be over. The storm is here, and we're going to go to the next normal, the next normal, the next normal, the next black swan, and it's going to continue. So we need to be ready for that. And so I think 2020 changes everything. First of all, 2020 accelerated history. And so that's why the title, 2020, one heck of a decade. If you look at online grocery, back in February, online grocery in the United States was about 2% of all grocery sales. If you look at in May, online grocery was 38% of all grocery sales. That's about a 20-year advance in online grocery. I predicted that we would see online grocery of about 40% in year 2050. And so it's unbelievable what has happened, how history got accelerated by COVID-19. Buy online, pick up at curb, back in February wasn't even a topic of discussion. We've had 10 years advance in how that service has increased. Consumer products companies, not even working with retailers, going direct to consumer themselves. The growth that's taken place, I say, is about a 10-year growth has occurred. If you look at supply chain from about 1980 to 1999 was focusing on cost reduction. From year 2000 through 2019, it was focused on profitable growth. How does a supply chain increase both the top line as well as increase the bottom line? And so we're looking at profitable growth. all of a sudden in 2020, in 1 year, we had 20 years of cost reduction, and then it took 20 years to be turned into profitable growth. So from 1980 to 2020, we went from looking at cost reduction to profitable growth. But then in 1 year in supply chain, we move away from profitable growth to looking at resilience and adaptability. We need to have a supply chain. More important than contributing profitable growth is a supply chain that produces resilience and adaptability in 1 year. And so 2020 has just accelerated history. 2020 has had impacts on us all. How we work, how we play, how we shop, how we enjoy life. We've basically stopped traveling. We don't have vacation travel very much anymore. We've stopped driving our cars. We stopped going to work, many of us, and we're working from home. A lot of the kids have stopped going to school. We've stopped going to movies. We stopped going to sporting events. I mean, my goodness, it's November. Typically in November, I'm going to NC State football, I'm going to Purdue football, I'm going to the Carolina Hurricanes hockey, and I'm getting ready for the start of Purdue and NC State basketball. This year, I'm not doing any of that. My wife and I had concert tickets. We didn't do any of that. I mean, it has changed how we enjoy our life. And so what we're seeing is that it's a total change in the way we live. I believe COVID-19 and 2020 and the pandemic have impacted our profession. It impacts how we work, how we design workplaces. It impacts what we do in factories, what we do in distribution and fulfillment centers. I think it's taken us away from thinking about distribution centers and fulfillment centers, and now we're thinking about DC, FC, RC, LC, distribution center, fulfillment center, return center, and liquidation center, all in one. And so that's a whole new concept. That's a history that's just been exploded forward. The way we look at stores and shopping centers and offices, the whole social distancing thing is different. I was at a soccer game yesterday of my grandkids, and we sat 6 feet apart from anyone else, and we wore masks, and we were at an outdoor soccer game. That would have been unheard of a year ago, but it was perfectly normal. It was the right thing to do. No one is even immune in any way from the impacts of 2020. It impacts everyone, everywhere, all the time. Independent of where you live, what work you do, who you are, it impacts us all. In fact, when I was a kid growing up, my mom and dad used to tell me at least once a week about the Great Depression and what impact that had, because it left a mark on them. I believe 30 years from now, my grandkids are going to be telling their kids about 2020. 2020 is one heck of a decade. 2020 and VUCA have had a huge impact on industrial and systems engineers. It impacts how we work. If you look at how industrial and systems engineers, how they think, their personality, the way they address themselves, the way they address their job, number one, they want to have control. They want to make sure that things meet their expectations and things that they say do come true. They want to be able to deal with predictability. They want to know what's going to happen, and they want to be able to have some assurance that what we think is going to happen actually does occur. They want to deal with certainty. They don't want to deal with surprises. They want to have things that are manageable and things that are understandable. They want to have things that are rational, that are comprehensible, that we understand. But which one of those? Control, predictability, certainty, being manageable, and being understandable. Which one of those exists today? Well, given the VUCA world we live in, all 5 of those are gone. We no longer have those mindsets. And so we have to put that thinking aside, and what we need to do is we have to look at how we work, how we think, what is it that we do? How do we contribute to our companies? How do we contribute to the success of the enterprise we're working with? So in a similar way, we find that industrial systems engineers love strategic planning. I worked in strategic planning for 40 years of my life. And now what I see is strategic planning doesn't work because no one can tell me what the requirements are. The requirements aren't known. It's uncertain. There's volatility. Things happen. There's going to be black swans arrive. And so we don't know what's going to happen. So how can you do strategic planning? You can't. You need to do scenario planning, where you look at the variety of scenarios that might happen. You plan for all of them. And then based on what really occurs, you make the decision what direction you're going to take. Industrial and system engineers strive for efficiency and effectiveness. And that's wonderful in the past, but going forward, more important than efficiency and effectiveness is resilience and adaptability. So we have to change what we do. Our profession is perfectly positioned to be ready to move forward, but the game is changing, and we need to address that. So what's going on with our profession? We're always going to have continuous improvement and transformation, but at this time, of 2020, there's 4 major reinventions that we as industrial and systems engineers need to address. First of all, we got to look at the workplaces. We've always maximized the efficiency and the effectiveness of what we're doing, but now we need to take a much stronger look at things like safety, the well-being, the personal hygiene, the personal space, and we got to understand how people interact. How do we manage gatherings? How do we manage interactions amongst people? How are we going to deal with talent shortages, and how are we going to deal with the different loyalties of people? So we have to reinvent our thinking about workplaces. We need to reinvent our thinking about optionality. And in fact, we have to replace the word optimality with the word optionality. And we need to look at the planning going forward, like I was saying about scenario thinking. We got to look at a variety of growth curves. We got to look at a variety of uncertainties and where they're going to go. We need to have adaptability, agility, and responsiveness in our solutions. We need to have ability to change paths as things occur. A black swan occurs. How do we respond to that? How do we change path? We traditionally have tried to streamline processes, but when we streamline processes, what oftentimes has happened, we have wound up with a brittle or a fragile solution. And so what we now need to do is to maybe back off of that streamlining, and what we need to do is to have a more robust solution that can cover a greater variety of circumstances. We need to be able to understand that disruptions, both internally and externally, are going to happen at a much greater pace. And therefore, we need to plan the options that we have going forward and need to think about optionality. Third, we need to think about automation. Labor shortages are having a big impact, but so are the need to replace dirty, unsafe jobs. And so automation is going to take over for an awful lot of manual tasks and for a lot of tasks that aren't really needed for people to perform. And so we're going to be looking at artificial intelligence and machine learning. The supply chains have been broken. There's problems with shortages, and there's problems with demand forecasting, and therefore with overages. And so we have a lack of resilience and adaptability in our supply chain. We need greater visibility, and we need a smart supply chain where we have one view of the truth, and we can use options to figure out how to move forward. So let's look at workplaces, optionality, automation, and supply chain with a little bit more detail. If we look at workplace reinvention, 4 topics. First of all, the remote workforce. What we find is that not only are you working from home, they're not even working close. A lot of people have moved from the metropolitan areas out to rural areas. And so they're not even planning on coming into work. And so this is going to impact how we hire people, how do you orientate people? The people that need to train them don't even come to work anymore. It's going to have a huge impact on culture. It's going to have a huge impact on the responsibility of the employers are going to grow because they got to look at the financial, the physical, and the mental health of their employees. We need to ask the question, what about sick leave? Can you get sick leave from mental health issues? What are the hours of work? What we're finding is now that we're not driving to work, most of us are working many more hours because there's not a natural close your laptop down at 5:30 and go home. Now you find yourself 9 o'clock at night still working. And so how does that impact the family? And how does that impact the culture of the company? How does it impact when one person is working at 9 and the other people aren't and he can't get an answer to his questions? And so the remote working is going to have a major impact on how work is done and therefore how workplaces are designed. Workplace impact are going to be great as a result of technology. What do you think about employee monitoring? Should the company be looking at how often you're online and what you're doing? Is that something that's going to occur? What about remote collaboration? I don't know about you, but I know myself, and I've talked to many others, we're kind of zoomed out. You know, do we really want to have meetings all day long and do that? I mean, what do we do with the dogs, the homeschool? How many of you right now are watching this video you got your pajamas on? Wouldn't you like to know? I mean, I look great with my my blue shirt and my sport coat, but I'm barefoot. I mean, my goodness sakes, that isn't how it usually goes. And so stuff is changing, and we need to respond to that. Employee certainty and employee loyalty is definitely been impacted. There's a lot of insecurities out there. There's been pay cuts, and there's an issue of trust of management. People are saying, does the boss really care about my safety? Does he really want me to come back into the office? What's the impact going forward on employee security with the increased use of contingency workers? There's going to be a lot of people that you work with on a daily basis that don't really work there. We need to know more about home life, and we need to have more knowledge about how do we separate what goes on at work versus what goes on at home. We need to look from a workplace point of view at how do we develop employees? How do we evolve people through their career when they're not in touch with their boss or their coworkers like they used to be? We need to make sure that our employees are a competitive strength of the company. And so we need to have enhanced communications. I've seen a lot of companies where communications have been low, and people don't really know what's going on in the company. We need to impact that. The old discussions around the water cooler and the discussions over lunch are very, very useful, and they stimulate the culture and the understanding of what's happening in a company. We need to look at cross-training. We need to look at the breadth of experience. And so the reinventing the workplace is very, very important. The second major thing we need to look at is optionality and the reinvention of our thought from optimality. I guess the question is, we need to go from optimal design to resilient designs. And that means we're not going to have a single objective function that we can maximize or minimize. And what we're going to be seeing is, I mean, the question really is, should we be working on trying to determine optimal solutions, or should we be developing solutions that offer a series of optional plans that we can move forward on? And if we do optionality, we develop a scenario. Here's scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3 of where we could go. And then we need to have real-time information of really what's happening so we can pivot to the right option and not pretend we know the future and that we can optimize, because optimization is obsolete. Optionalization, where we look at options and we look at how we can develop a plan that's going to occur even though the future is uncertain. We need anti-brittle, we need anti-fragile solutions that are a series of solutions that are deployed over time. And so anti-brittle solutions are about optionality, where we have an optimal solution that we're going to follow until this happens, then we're going to have another optimal solution until this happens, then we're going to have another optimal solution until this happens. It's like a basketball game. There's a series of options on each play depending upon what the external force does to you. Optionality is superior from 2020 and beyond to optimality. In fact, given the uncertainty and volatility of today, I believe optionality is the new optimal. We need real-time information to understand when to pivot. Knowing how to pivot is important, but just as important is knowing when to pivot. And so we need to have real-time information as to what's taking place so we now understand, this was optimal for the last 3 months, but now we need to make this switch to a new path for the next 3 months. So it's really important that we have real-time information that we can make decisions as to when we should pivot. Scenario planning is going to replace strategic planning. Strategic planning, as I said, assumes you know the requirements. But with VUCA, we do not know the requirements. So with scenario planning, we have to say, okay, what are the things that are really important to us, and what are the different scenarios that could take place? So let's take a simple example. Let's say I'm trying to develop a budget for my company, and the two major things that are in play are what is the growth of the market I'm in, and what is the impact of my market share. And so let's say for each of those, we can have a low market growth or a low market share, or we can have a high market growth and a high market share. So there's 4 scenarios there. We can have low market growth and low market share. We could have low market growth and high market share. We could have high market growth and low market share, or we could have high market growth and high market share. And so we now have 4 scenarios that we need to plan for. And we need to say, here is the plans that we're going to deploy for these 4 scenarios. And then what we will do is we will keep our eyes open to what's taking place in the marketplace, take place with respect to what's going on with our market share, and we then have the path forward to allow us to be successful as those scenarios play out, and we can take the right option at the right time. Third, us industrial and systems engineers need to look at automation reinvention. The reality is that the direct labor availability is not there. There's severe shortages, and there's a lot of folks that were laid off as a result of COVID-19, and they're going to be switching careers. So you're not going to just call those people back. And so we really need to understand, what are we going to be doing with respect to automation to replace the people that are no longer there and won't be coming back? This is true not only in direct labor, but it's also true in other aspects of the company. There's a huge amount of layoffs that have taken place in finance and IT because the world has changed there. And so we can automate the functions of finance and IT and supply chain. And so we're going to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to do the work that used to take 20 people is now going to take 10 people. In manufacturing, the same is true with direct labor. And so what we're going to have is a COVID-19 has turned out to be an automation forcing event, and it's enabling automation. What we're seeing is robotics is going way beyond where it's basically practiced, which is automotive and maybe some packaging. But what we're seeing is robots taking place across industries and having a tremendous amount of application. Fourth, what we're seeing is a lot of each handling, where in the old days, the unit load principle says keep things in the container for as long as you can, and then when you have to break the container, keep it in a pallet for as long as you can, and then keep it in the case forever. Never open the case until it gets to the store. Well, what happened is we're not going to the store, we're selling it direct to consumer, so we're opening cases and we're dealing with eaches. In fact, a lot of companies now, instead of replenishing cases to store, they're replacing eaches to store because a case of product might wind up being 4 months of supply on the store shelf. It doesn't make sense. And so each handling is an awesome opportunity for automation, and it's having a huge impact on how business is operated around direct-to-consumer business and around to replenishment of stores. And so automation and robotics is a major area for us to be reinventing our thought process. The fourth area we need to address is supply chain reinvention. True real-time end-to-end visibility is needed. We need the information on a real-time basis, and we need it for the entire network, we need a network platform that looks at the entire network. And so it's not the first node talking to the second node talking to the third talking to the fourth, and the fourth talking to the fifth. We need to have a network platform that when one node speaks, everyone has a real-time knowledge and has one version of the truth. And so when a truck is late between node 2 and 3, node 7 is going to know that and the implication that it's going to have upon them. So we need real-time end-to-end visibility. We need to understand that the planning and execution is obsolete. The pace at which things happen today, it is not the words planning and execution, but it's a single word called planning execution. It's a continuous process of planning and execution. A boom, 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 boom. And we're going to be planning, execution, planning, execution, planning, execution. So there's an original plan, and that you design an original execution for, but the second that hits the reality and the first node does something, we're doing planning and execution on a real-time basis. A third issue is a control tower mentality that allows us to facilitate adaptability, where the control tower is looking at the total end-to-end supply chain and is making determinations of how we're going to solve problems. It's using artificial intelligence and machine learning to look at the supply chain and to make decisions that today are made manually. But the machines are going to make this, and they're going to have a tremendous reduction in the number of supply chain planners and supply chain executors. Those won't be needed. And so what we're going to find is a control tower taking over those activities and responding in real time to real-time events. We're going to find a network ecosystem analytics that looks at the end-to-end supply chain. And so what are we doing with respect to key issues, with respect to customer service? What are we doing with respect to inventory turns? How are we responding to these in a way that really allows us to facilitate disruptions? We can deal with uncertainty, and we have the agility to pivot to the next solution to wind up having the customer thinks that everything is working fine. And so we have four major areas that we as industrial engineers need to look at. We need to look at workplaces, optionality, automation, and supply chain. So, in conclusion, 2020 has been one heck of a decade. The black swans are ongoing, they're occurring. There's going to be some black swans this week that take place. VUCA is an everyday event. VUCA, every day I say to myself, VUCA, VUCA, I'm holy VUCA, it's happening. And so uncertainty is certain. And therefore we have to change the approach that we industrial and systems engineers take to problem solving. Today is a whole different game than what it was in 2019. You cannot continue to do what you did a year ago when you were successful and be successful going forward. You need to reinvent the job that you're doing. The lessons learned in 2020 are huge. The impacts on workplaces, the impact on optionality, the impact on automation, impact on supply chain are huge. They're all game changers, and we need to address these. Industrial and systems engineers have a huge impact on the future. Our role has got more important as a result of black swans, as a result of VUCA. And so our role has become critical to the success of our organization. And so some professions have grown in importance and some have gone down. Industrial and systems engineers is more important going forward than it has been in the past. We need to reinvent how we educate industrial and systems engineers, how we work, and we need to reinvent our profession to be ready to do the workplaces, the optionality, the automation, and the supply chain. We need to be prepared differently. And so we need to reinvent to allow us to meet the ongoing disruptions which will continue to come. There will not be steady state. There will not be a new normal. It's going to be a continued evolution of new disruptions, new black swans, new VUCA that impacts how we move forward. The last 10 months have lasted 10 years. Are you ready? Industrial and systems engineers have a critical responsibility. We need to fasten our seat belts. We need to think creativity. We need to deploy innovation, and we need to understand that our role is more important than ever. Industrial and systems engineer is going to be a absolute bedrock of the future of business in the United States and around the world.